The wildlife sector have been primed into the fabric of Kenyans and also to the Kenyan government. Kenya has always been known to be the custodian of wildlife in Africa, but definitely with many more players in the continent, but we have been championing this agenda. We have been the pioneer of conservation. Without Kenya in CITES, that CITES meeting will not take place effectively. So we play a major role in the world conservation of wildlife. But definitely, before, wildlife used to be connected with hunting. During the colonial times, post-independence, we went and stopped hunting. And we banned hunting and we introduced photography tourism. And this will remain for a long time in Kenya in terms of no hunting in this country. I know our neighbors and the region probably have a combination of hunting and tourism, but then that balance is very difficult for us in Kenya, and we have made a decision, a very conscious decision, that there'll be no hunting in Kenya. But nevertheless, I am proud that today the sector is vibrant. KWS is stronger than before. The communities are stronger than before, and we have actually put a framework as government. How do we see these community conservancies work? But also private conservancies like Olpejeta and others. But this is the concept that the government has brought it, and I believe is the right concept. As well as we have opened up the space for NGOs and non-state actors to be vibrant and contribute objectively and positively to this sector. But yes, I can say that we are very proud. We have a big conservation area. Our percentage is only 18% to 20%, 23 parks, 26 conservancies, 26 reserves, 160 community conservancies, and over 150 NGOs in this sector. So we have a strong and vibrant community around us. Definitely for a long time, we have been facing the challenge of how do we protect the endangered species? The endangered species, particularly about the key endangered species, which is the elephants and rhinos. And because there has been a trade which has been operating, and we have been in the forefront as Kenya, but pushing Africa and pushing the world on the fight against the ivory trade. And we are fighting to conserve the pangolins. We are fighting to conserve the turtles and the rest. But I can tell you quickly, I know my time is running out. 2017, poaching in Kenya reduced to 80 elephants. 2018, 38 elephants. 2019, 38 elephants. 2020, up to April, end of April, 5 elephants were poached. In terms of rhino, 2017, we got 9 rhinos poached. 2018, 4 rhinos poached. And 2019, 4 rhinos poached. Till now, up to April 2020, 0 rhinos have been poached. We keep our fingers closed. So our anti-poaching programs have been very successful. Yes, we still have challenges. And probably we worked very well in anti-poaching. We forgot the other responsibilities. Human-wildlife conflict is key. Bushmeat trade is key. Space for wildlife and the corridors is key. Decline of other species also is key. But the most important thing, and allow me, Helen, to take one more minute, the corona pandemic has a major effect, not only to Kenya, but globally. The global impact, the GDP of the world was 3.4% in 2019. 2020 projection is minus 3%. Sub-Saharan GDP in 2019 was 3.6%. Projection in the sub-Saharan region for 2020 will be minus 1%. Kenya GDP was 6% 2019. 2020 projection is 1.5%. You could see the impact. The biggest sector that have been affected is tourism and transport. So it's not only about tourism and hospitality, it means restaurants and all the eateries, those are under tourism and hospitality. Transport is not only about airlines and railways, but it is about road transport as well. So every aspect of that sector has been affected. But again, the key issue, how do we now diversify because of post-COVID? The financing, how do we get financing in this sector? The conservation sector, I can tell you, KWS, I want to just be focused on KWS. KWS, a cost of running KWS is $70 million. That is 7 billion shillings. KWS has 6,000 employees they have to take care of, spread all over the country, because all the responsibilities is KWS in charge of wildlife. And then we have 2 million visitors who come to our parks, which 25% are foreigners and 75% of those visitors are Kenyans. The revenue, 21% is contributed by locals, and 79% of the revenue is contributed by tourists, foreign tourists. So you could see how tourism is important in the sustainability of revenues for KWS. I have done some research with my team at KWS. The global funding to Kenya in the last 5 years, 2019 backwards, has been almost $130 million. Average of almost $25 million annually just comes to the sector. $1 million go to KWS, $25 million go to other players in the sector. So you could see that how dependent KWS is on tourism. And also, I believe the conservancies are dependent on tourism revenues and park entry fees as well. So yes, it's a big challenge, but today we are dialoguing. Today we are not making policy decisions. Today we are enriching the ideas to make it work. So I will open the discussion to everybody, and I want to thank once again the panelists and Helen, and as well the audience, the participants who are there. What do we do to move forward together? Thank you very much. I submit.
Thank you, CS, for your remarks. And I'm sure there will be questions coming about some of the statistics you've given us. Let us proceed straight to the other panelists, and we will start with Brigadier Waweru, the Director General of Kenya Wildlife Service, to really give us a sense and a state of play Kenya Wildlife Service and what the current impacts are. Any thoughts for the future?
Thank you. Thank you very much, moderator, Dr. Helen Gishoi. Yes, good afternoon, CS, ladies and gentlemen, and our attendees. I'm going to run very, very quickly, and I'm going to ask the technical people to kindly put up my presentation, because I want to take you through what I would like to call the preamble, just to set us all on the same footing. And then thereafter, in COVID and post-COVID, and what KWS is doing as far as that is concerned. Let's go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Next slide, please. Yes. Now, parks are created for different reasons. And clearly, either it's geology, ecology, water catchments, etc., etc. In Kenya, 10 out of the 23 parks generate 80% of the revenue that we earn annually from conservation fees. The total conservation fees contribute 61% of the total income of the service. Most parks generate insignificant revenues or no revenues at all, but they still have exceptional value for humanity, even though they do not generate funds for us. The service has jurisdiction for wildlife, not only in the parks, but even outside the parks, in public designated protected areas, which is an additional cost at Kenya Wildlife Service. Space for wildlife has been reducing significantly, and I mean, it's pretty clear why that is happening. The population of humanity has gone up. The spaces that the human beings now demand is much more, so there's a tendency to also encroach onto spaces that were for wildlife, and then as well the change in land use. Security and anti-poaching operations account for over 50% of the budget of the service. The conservation model has over-reliance on tourism, and yet there are other areas and other things that we can do within the parks that will also, as I shall explain later. Most conservation agencies in developed and developing countries are subsidized by government and partners. And we need to have reactive response to incidents, as mentioned by the CS, incidents of human-wildlife conflict. Let's have the next slide, please. Thank you. The next one, not you're going back. Now, let's look at what has happened at Kenya Wildlife Service during the COVID period. If you look on the left-hand side of the screen, I'll take you through that. There's been a significant drop in internally generated revenue by, it's around about 50%, because we had already generated a significant amount before COVID. And visitor numbers have dropped significantly. In fact, in some areas and some parks, they're actually zero. We're not getting any visitors at all. We've seen an escalation in, well, a slight escalation in bushmeat poaching and associated crime. Clearly, there are quite a few more people now, probably in the rural areas, than they are generally. We do get people wanting to go into the parks, to want to hunt things like dick and other areas, and other animals rather. There's been a suspension of key activities, including wildlife census, which is very important to us because we like to know how many animals we have. But because of COVID, that has been suspended. CSR projects, education and educational programs, those have also been affected. And of course, we are relying mainly on government subvention because of the fact that we are now not generating funds as we used to before COVID. So what has been our response? Our response was first to institute within KWS and all parks mandatory screening of staff and visitors because we need to know who is coming into the park, including our own selves. We set up a toll-free line for purposes of reporting. We have suspended training in 2 of our training institutions. That is the Law Enforcement Academy at Manyani and the Kenya Wildlife Service Training Institute in Naivasha. We've had to do that, again, of course, because we want to observe government regulations as far as gathering of people and having people in a certain space. We've scaled down operations by about 60 to 70% in 20 parks and confined it to 20 parks at least, for operations within those areas. Of course, it does not mean we've moved out of the other parks, but it's just that we scale down operations in those areas, but maintain security, of course. There's also been a merger of outposts and in process reduced from 144 to 123. The parks we manage are 144. That is all areas, parks and reserves, and all areas that we manage. And we've had to reduce now to 123 because that is important for us to still maintain security in those areas. We have a very proactive human-wildlife conflict patrols and strategic deployment of problem animal management unit, what we call the PAMO, because we're also seeing, and I don't think it's COVID, I think it's just the season. There's been a coincidence between COVID and also the season. During the rainy season, animals tend to want to go out. And because of that, we're seeing an increase in human-wildlife conflict. We're working with partners, especially conservancies, that have community scouts and honorary wardens in areas where we have coverage gaps. As the CS said, we cover a huge area, and it's plus the external conservancies, parks and reserves. You're talking about 20% of the landmass of Kenya. So it's quite an expansive area. Then we are engaging in more enhanced community sensitization and awareness creation using local radio, TV, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. So what do we see ourselves doing as we go to the post-COVID period? One, we have to rebrand the product we have. As I mentioned earlier, we were depending on just tourism or being able to just go into the parks and that's it. But we want to begin to look at that product. Is that product still a valid product as far as what we have at the ground? And also considering the fact that we are now going to get less visitors coming from outside. That is the approach. And we are starting off with the 10 top parks as we move on to the other parks. Now, we must carry out very aggressively targeted communication and marketing for the domestic and regional markets. We think that if we focus on the regional and domestic market, we have no option at the moment, because we don't expect international visitors will be coming in soon, maybe in a year or so. So we need to reorganize ourselves. Now, we need to find ways, innovative ways to generate revenue by changing the mode in which we operate. We also need to do something a little different. Like, for example, we need to go to ecosystem services and carbon credits. And that is something we're successfully doing in Chulu. We need to extend this to other areas which we manage. We need to develop, sorry, Daktari, have I run out of time? Let me quickly run through. Yes, development of an e-commerce website, modernize the way we do our operations, use modern technology, we need targeted special education and conservation programs. We need to use special technology for fencing and other areas. We need to engage strategic partnership, career progression planning, multi-skilling of our rangers, and so on and so forth. So Kenya Wildlife Service is now having to change the way it works, the way it conducts its business, so that we can then be able to manage in a period which has given us quite tremendous challenges. Thank you very much. I know I've taken up a little more time than I indicated. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brigadier. I hope we'll be able to come back with a few clarifications as we go along. I think the next panelist who is going to help us set the stage and tell us about wildlife management in community areas and on community conservancies is Mr. Dixon Kaelo. Welcome, Dixon. You have 7 minutes. Dixon, we can't hear you.
Sorry about that. I think you can hear me now. Yeah, so thank you very much, Helen, and thank you, Waziri, for organizing this important webinar where we are going to be talking about an important subject on remodeling conservation as we go through this COVID situation. My name is Dixon Kaelo, and I work for the Kenya Wildlife Conservancies Association, which is an umbrella body for conservancies in Kenya. And we work very closely with the ministry, and we partner with the Kenya Wildlife Service to see that wildlife, both inside and outside the park, because Kenya is a very Kenya implements a very open conservation model, and therefore we work together to partner and mobilize our communities to participate in protecting these important national assets and natural resource. And as we get into this stage, crises are always the best times to design a new normal. And so I'm very happy to be part of this discussion today to look at areas where we've made progress and areas where we can do better. During this pandemic situation, we can reflect back and realize that indeed Kenya has made a lot of successes. We've had our own challenges like every other country, and we may also have our own failures. And I think it's very important as well to appreciate on our failures and work through to create a new normal that will be much better than what we have been working on today. I think some of the big successes for Kenya, number one is the fact that really Kenyans love our wildlife. We are a country where a lot of people make a lot of noise even when one animal is killed. I think Waziri will attest to this. They almost will lynch you. So generally, I think this is really positive that we have a country where people really love wildlife. We have a lot of influence, both in research, both in international policy, as Waziri said, and we've grown our capacity to improve on our management skills. We are also, of course, one of the richest countries. We are third in terms of biodiversity. We practice an open landscape conservation strategy, which is really good for wildlife. But sometimes we've been caught into sort of a dichotomy where we manage wildlife on one hand and people on the other hand. And sometimes I think failing to see the connection. And I think this is one of the key things that we can take forward and really think about how do we manage wildlife by thinking about people, and how can we support people and the development of people by thinking about wildlife. This is, for me, a very important remodeling that we need to do, so that we avoid this dichotomy where we see conservation as one thing and development as the other thing. Also recognizing that our national parks and reserves are generally our cornerstone. They are the building block. They are the foundation of our conservation success. And considering that compared to other countries, we have perhaps less coverage. That therefore means that we need to think about areas outside of these parks. And we also need to think about what priority we are giving to these parks in terms of both tourism and wildlife. And I think sometimes we are criticized for focusing too much on tourism, and to a large extent, to a little less on biodiversity conservation, so that some of the national parks and reserves that are not very much appealing for tourism get neglected. So we may need to begin also thinking about how can we better manage these areas that are important for biodiversity, but may not be as valuable for tourism. I think also that we celebrate our strong conservation policy. Kenya has one of the best wildlife acts. Our fines for illegal wildlife crime is one of the highest in Africa. And also our reforms after the Constitution of 2010, our reforms in policy has really improved. And though we have sometimes need to think more about implementation, I think that some of the policies, the wildlife policy we've been developing from 2011, we are just at the tail end of it. It shouldn't take that long if we need to be more progressive. We have a very strong national wildlife strategy. To what extent are we implementing it? I think it's a very valid question we need to think about. We have also a very important corridors report that was produced a little while ago. To what extent are we implementing it? And therefore, the Wildlife Act as well is one of the best, as I mentioned earlier. To what extent are we implementing it? And I think we need to be to focus a little bit more on implementation rather than policy creation. I think also not stepping out of our mandate, really thinking for KWS. I think sometimes the role that KWS does, both as a research organization, as a regulator, as a law enforcer, as an organization responsible for mobilizing communities, as a wildlife management agency, as a training entity, to what extent are we balancing all these roles? And are there roles that may be suffering? And I'm just thinking as we go through this situation and create the new normal, we may need to think about really the role of KWS, so that we don't sometimes overburden it, at the same time underfund it, and expect it to undertake all these important roles. I think also the role of the county governments. I have been to the several county governments, and because the Constitution defines wildlife conservation as a national function, at some point you feel the county government feels left out. They don't sometimes, they actually sometimes act in ways that is counterproductive for wildlife. Perhaps some like Narok, which historically has had the advantage of being in the forefront of wildlife management. Counties like Samburu, Baringo that have been contributing are doing something. But I think we need to rethink how can we position our county governments, because they are on the ground and they have some resources to really take on conservation as a key part of their sector. I think also the tourism model that we implement need to be rethinked. I think that often the kind of tourism we undertake does not reflect the cost of conservation. The actors who undertake a massive cost of living with wildlife which will include the camps, the lodges, the conservation managers, the conservancies, sometimes are on the lower end of the benefit, and the commissions and the middle level agents are sometimes taking the lion's share of the tourism cake. And I think we need to rethink about that. How can we create a tourism model that really puts money to the product? And because if we don't sustain the product, then we do not have a good experience to our guests. Specifically, coming to the conservancies really came up very recently. We are on sort of our third decade, and we have a projection, a growth that has been linearly increasing. More land is coming into conservation, and again, if you look at the land under conservation, is quite significant. And if you look at that map, the brown areas are conservancies, and they generally are well covering now, and we have a big chance to increase that. There is also a lot of benefits that come to these conservancies, and we can get into that in more detail. But given this moment, when we are in this COVID situation, we really are seeing a big challenge. We are seeing that a lot of our camps have closed, the conservancies are suffering, and tourism is largely the main source of revenue for the conservancies. And again, this is becoming a bit of a challenge. In the Mara, for example, the conservancies are struggling to keep leases that have been signed for 25 years to continue. I think I may be overstepping my time.
You're done? One?
No, I still have a few things to say. So
one more minute.
One more minute. Thank you very much.
Yes.
So I think there are a few things that we can begin working on as we go through this pandemic. First of all, thank you, Waziri. The government is doing a lot of efforts, a lot of meetings with us to define ways to create sustainability approaches, to create funds to keep the rangers on the ground so that the conservancies survive this period. I think that's really important, and we're looking forward to concluding that discussion. I think that even as we go through after this COVID situation, we need to think more about how we diversify our income opportunities, how to strengthen the community institutions that manage our wildlife, how to see definitely these conservancies as social enterprises, also how to strengthen our pastoralist livestock production system, because livestock is the mainstay of our communities, and if we think about programs that support livestock production, then we reduce reliance on tourism, and conservancies like Olpejeta, Mara North in the Mara are already demonstrating how livestock, if integrated and managed well, is an important part of our conservancies. The tourism, I mentioned the tourism, to redesign our tourism, we need to think about domestic tourism. The conservancies, to a large extent, have depended on international tourism, high market tourism, but the potential we have in domestic tourism needs to be exploited. We need to establish the National Wildlife Fund as provided in the Wildlife Act.
Shall we stop there now?
Thank you very much.
Yes,
and also think about other things like carbon and others. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dixon. I think we'll have an opportunity perhaps to come back and elaborate on a few of those things, but I think in the interest of time, let's move on to Richard, who will tell us about a private conservancy, the Olpejeta Conservancy. Richard, if I may ask us to keep to our time so that we don't spill over and eat into the time of the other panelists. Thank you, Richard, and welcome.
Helen, thanks. I'd like to start, but Dixon, you need to turn off your screen share.
Yeah, thank you.
Let me try now. Okay, hopefully that's come up. I apologize, I forgot it was on Adobe, so it's not a PowerPoint presentation, but I hope it will be clear. I put this slide up because I think it's important to begin with. This is a commonly accepted definition of conservation in the modern world. Wise management and utilization of natural renewable resources in a sustainable manner to ensure the maintenance of biodiversity. So I think it's just keep that in the background. So I was asked to speak about the model that is, my slides are not going down, hang on. There we are, sorry. I was asked to speak about the model that we on the Untitled Conservancy have developed over the last 15 years. And I think the reason for that is because we tend to be considered fairly atypical from a conservation perspective and in the way that conservation organizations often work. To give you a little bit of background, we're a not-for-profit organization. We work very, very closely with the Kenya Wildlife Services and government. We have developed an integrated land use system that aims primarily to maximize productivity and profitability in a manner that secures conservation space and the maintenance of biodiversity. So that's our kind of philosophy. We are home to the largest single population of black rhino in East and Central Africa. We have very high predator densities and good numbers of all other wildlife. And we are visited on an annual basis, or at least we were before COVID-19, by about 110,000 people per year, of which 60% come from the domestic market. As has been reported by others on this panel, COVID has resulted in a 95%, or we expect COVID to result in a 95% loss to that business this year. That for us is a drop in revenue of about $3.5 to $4 million, which is a hole that we're going to have to fill to pay for the fixed costs of conservation. So we also believe that conservation is as much about social, attending to social needs as it is about attending to the protection of animals and habitat. So we have a large community support program, which costs us around about $1 million a year. For us, conservation is as much about being an engine for economic development and social prosperity as it is about looking after wildlife. And for us, those two things have to go together. So let me talk a little bit more about our integrated land use system. We took a decision at the beginning of the Untitled Conservancy to integrate our existing herd of 6,500 head of cattle in the same space as our wildlife, including our predators. What it means is that we have an alternative revenue stream that is less fickle than tourism and helps keep our fixed conservation costs paid for when tourism disappears. It also means that we can employ 1,000 people and that we can maximize profits, all of which are reinvested back into more conservation, the creation of more conservation space, and community support programs. So in essence, what this does is, or in essence, what the integrated system does is it acts to reduce the opportunity costs of conservation. And we believe it's a fundamentally important way for conservation to be considered, particularly on private lands. But unfortunately, that model, notwithstanding its strengths, in this era of zero tourism is really not going to be enough. So what do we believe needs to happen in the private sector, Kenya private sector conservation space to make us more robust? If we lose tourism, we're still, as I've explained, going to be struggling seriously to keep ourselves alive. So what do we need to do going forwards, and what are some of our experiences that we can now bring to bear to the future to make ourselves more financially stable and robust? Let me talk about tourism. We know it's fickle. We've seen what happens. But I believe that there's a great opportunity, particularly in Kenya, to make our tourism a whole lot better than it currently is. Dixon and others have talked on it about the value chain being stacked against the conservation agencies, and how structural changes to the tourism industry may help. But I also think we need to react to global demand, and we need to develop more engaging and immersive products. We've got to learn lessons, and people poo-poo this when I talk about it, but we've got to learn lessons from Western zoo models, for example, by exploiting every opportunity we can to make money, to value add, and to increase per person spend. So often you see money left on the table when you go to national parks and various other places, and for me, that needs to change. Better product translates into more demand, which in turn translates into more bed night sales and entrance fees. Imagine if we could get $15 out of every single client coming to all of our parks and conservancies, how much that would dramatically improve our financial fortunes. I also think philanthropy is something that we should not ignore. I understand and we all understand the difficulties of it, but there are people out there who want to help us preserve wildlife, who believe in the social, the power of conservation to have great positive influence from a social perspective. And I just think what we need to be doing is making it more efficient than it currently is. We need to be maximizing unrestricted incomes, and we need to be doing everything possible to ensure that we make more of that positive social impact that particularly the conservancy model in Kenya provides, something that would be very attractive to donors. But imagine, for example, if the Kenya Wildlife Services could use technology which exists to consistently convert 10% of Kenya's overseas visitors into $10 donors per month, or $10 per month donors. That would be phenomenal, and it would result in an unrestricted stream of income, which we currently don't have. So I've also got some slightly different ideas, and this is something that Olpejida has been doing for a little while. Sacrifice a little.
Richard, can you run them quickly, 1 minute?
Sure, I can. So sacrificing a little to save a lot. We've sacrificed a few thousand acres to create the revenues necessary to invest into much bigger and to preserve much bigger areas. Residential housing schemes and agriculture are two examples. Taking a more business-like approach. Let's go to the corporates in Kenya, and instead of saying, give us money, donate money, let's have a business deal. Let's say you give us money for our community programs, and we will give you exposure to our huge social media following so that you also benefit from your relationship with us. Let's look at other businesses. We're looking at the moment at an energy supply company through microgrids in the communities around us, from which we think we can make small profits. And let's think of some zany ideas. Sofa safaris, the use of virtual media, getting to a global audience that we currently can't get to as a means to drive up social media followings and drive up donated revenues in the process. Engagement with clients globally is going to be fundamentally important for the long-term recovery of our tourism industry. So for me, it's all about thinking just a little bit differently. It's thinking of conservation as a business. It's thinking of it as something which is investable, from which we can make profit to build.
It seems we have lost Richard. I think we have lost Richard. So while he was getting to the tail end of his presentation, and what I propose we do is that we proceed to the next group of panelists who are going to be presenting and walking us through some of the new ideas and the new thinking around the post-COVID era. We've already heard quite a bit about it from all the panelists who have gone through the first session. And what I would urge the panelists who are coming after this is that we run through this quickly. The first group of panelists took a lot too long, and so we are running out of time. And so I would urge is that we go straight into the second segment. Bwana CS, you had comments you wanted to make. Can you take 2 minutes?
Yes, sure, Helen. Thank you very much, colleagues and participants and everybody who is watching this webinar. I want to thank the presenters. I'm definitely talking about rethinking the new policy, innovation, technology, financing, fresh investment, and PPPs, and the people of Kenya. Those are the things we need to for post-COVID. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Waziri. We'll go straight into the second segment about the post-COVID era. And the first person to present will be Winnie Cairo. Winnie, if you could take 5 minutes.
I'll start my presentation by really putting up on the screen an image that some of you have seen and many of you probably haven't. This animal is called the pangolin, and many of us, I can tell you, even who spend a lot of time in the bush, will tell you we haven't seen the pangolin. But for some reason, this pangolin is going extinct. It has been traded seriously across, and indeed, so much so that in 2016, Kenya, among a group of other countries from Africa and Asia, submitted a proposal to United Nations Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species to increase the level of protection on this species. And effectively, a commercial ban on the trade in pangolin was instituted, and the ban came into effect in January, just last month. Traffic, which is the wildlife trade monitoring network, published a report on wildlife trade and COVID. And this is what they said. Although the origins of the disease are currently unproven, there are strong indications of a wild animal source and are direct linked to wildlife trade in China. Specifically, a significant proportion of early cases in China involve people who worked at or visited a market in Wuhan where wild animals were on sale, and initial research points to a possible transmission pathway from birds via pangolins to people. So essentially, this problem that we are faced with, this pandemic, Kenya and a group of other countries already warned the world, asked for closure of these illegal markets, got this closure instituted through CITES. But now, because of some leakages, some loopholes in this market, the fact that wildlife crime is serious crime, and these crimes are perpetrated by people with lots of money, this trade continued. Look what it has cost the world. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because as we look at sustainability and remodeling of our wildlife sector, we must think about where this has all started. We must recognize that the global community needs to take cognizance of why we are in this situation and to really start to wonder whether we are putting our money where we are supposed to. Now, if we think of how long it's going to take us to get out of this problem, we are talking now about post-COVID and remodeling post-COVID. What is post-COVID? When is normal going to be? Is it in months? Is it in years? Are we waiting for a vaccine? Are we waiting for some curative solution? Is it Madagascar COVID organics? What scenario is this we are talking about? When we talk about post-COVID, when is it going to be? When are we actually going to be post-COVID? Because this is an important consideration when we think about the strategies that we need to put in place post-COVID, because I suspect highly that that place called post-COVID is a place that none of us know, because all remodeling that we're going to do has to take the effect, the economic and social costs of COVID, the new normal in terms of individuals and what they think they need to do, where they need to spend their money. So the new normal is very much going to be related to what post-COVID is. It's going to be related to what we do in terms of wildlife markets. If we continue having the kind of wildlife markets that we have, then there will be no post-COVID. So now let's go on and think about going forward. What can Kenya do? The elephants are already showing us the way. We have some gains that we have received from COVID, which we did nothing about. We did nothing to achieve. This elephant was pictured in the newspapers yesterday, visiting governor's camp in Masai Mara. So maybe some of the advantages we are getting from COVID is that we have cleaner air, our wildlife is roaming free. Maybe we are even going to get some restoration of some species that had suffered greatly from over-tourism, over-exploitation, just the presence of tourism. We have listened to the other panelists. telling us about the challenge that we have faced with over-tourism. So going forward, what do we need to do in Kenya? I think one of the things we need to focus on is sustaining some of these so-called gains, or what we view as gains of COVID. We need to sustain this, because if cleaner air is good for us, if free wildlife is good for us, if conservation is actually going to stop the next pandemic, we need to sustain these gains, and we need the whole world to work with us, because if it doesn't, then we are never going to go to the post-COVID era. Where can we start as a country? I think we have a good place to start. And Waziri, thank you very much for pushing forward this idea of having a national wildlife strategy, because we are not planning from nothing. We are starting from what we know. As we go to all those great innovative ideas, we need to start from what we already know. So our ecosystems, which we have a pillar in our national wildlife strategy saying we need resilient ecosystems. What does that look like? Where do we need to put our money post-COVID?
Let me interrupt you. You have 1 minute.
Yes. Okay. We need to really think about what those resilient ecosystems look like. We need to think about what engaging Kenyans look like. From the NGO sector, we think that there is a real need for NGOs to get involved, because if we're talking about thinking like about business, thinking of conservation as a business, I think government may have certain limitations which NGOs can fill in very well, in terms of if we're going to go to private investors and tell them we're looking at conservation bonds, we are looking at new instruments of looking at conservation. The NGOs are resilient, the NGOs are flexible, the NGOs refocus funding very quickly. The NGOs have a good reach that they can use to bring in this idea. So what I would say is we need everybody on the table. We need to think about sustainable finance and governance in such a way that we don't reinvent the wheel, thinking of Kenya Wildlife Service as the organization that's going to fix everything, but really bringing everybody to the table. And as we think of sustainable financing, as we reach out, not just here in Kenya to private sector, to the Kenyan public, to everybody, we need to know who is going to be on the table doing that. We need the communities on the table, the NGOs on the table, we need government on the table, we need private sector on the table. How do we coalesce this movement? We need to move people from the menu and really have them on the table discussing sustainable financing and governance of our wildlife resource. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy, and sorry to rush you. It's amazing how quickly time flies and how quickly time goes. We all have so much we would say about on this webinar, but let's rush through as quickly as possible. I know there is people wondering what happened to Richard. He was presenting some rather novel and out-of-the-box ideas. Hopefully we'll have some time to bring Richard back. I'd like us to go straight to Giles. Giles, your 7 minutes just shrunk to 5 because of time. So would you launch right in and walk us through quickly? If you could avoid repeating what's already been said in the interest of time, that would be truly appreciated. Thank you, Giles.
Sure, thanks, Helen. And again, thank you, Waziri, for this opportunity. I'm going to talk a little bit about revenue and finance and conservation and some opportunities that I think this crisis may precipitate. I'll talk mainly about commercial revenue. I think governments in these scenarios have the opportunity to potentially divert public funds through various tax instruments, levies. But let's focus on commercial instruments. Tourism has been mentioned widely. All I will say is it's very important that we don't write off tourism. It was an important industry, a growing one, and it will come back one day. And we need to make sure that we don't lose the infrastructure or the capability to deliver on it once again. The domestic market, again, has been repeatedly mentioned, but it's an obvious thing to be thinking more emphatically about at this time. And there's some great examples in this country. Richard mentioned that 60,000 of 115 of his guests are local Kenyans. You've got the Adventure Centre done with KWS in the Aberdares. That would be 49,000 out of their 50,000 typical annual guests. And KWS again has a high number of domestic consumers in tourism. But outside tourism, there are opportunities, and we need to break some conventions here. Again, we've heard about livestock. Conservation purists may not potentially value the presence of livestock in natural environments. But interestingly, if you take high-end tourism as a proxy for pure wilderness, some of the highest-end tourism products in this country are based in conservancies, whether they're private or community, where there's a high presence of livestock. And livestock can be important economically, they can be important socio-politically, as a food production source, food security, and in fact, they can be very important ecologically. And again, there are real examples of this. Olpejeta, Lewa, Loisaba, Barana Conservancy, Soisamba in the Rift Valley, and of course, community conservancies in the Masai Mara and in North Kenya with Northern Rangers Trust. Agriculture, again, a little bit more difficult to integrate into a natural environment. But again, there's useful examples of this in this country. Olpejeta has an agricultural section. They sacrifice a little to save more, as I think Richard was saying. Lewa has an agricultural program. Barana Conservancy has hived off some land, again, for agriculture, and it can be very complementary, at least economically. Carbon, again, a slightly black art to many, but again, there's real examples. And in this country, the Brigadier mentioned it earlier on, in the Kasagawa corridor, it wasn't just a Kenya first, it was a world first, generating significant amounts of finance for a large 500,000 acre conservation estate, large numbers of employment, and crucially large amounts of money. Not in Kenya, but the Biocarbon Partners business down in Zambia, likewise, real money in real landscapes at scale. Biodiversity offsets may emerge. I may come back to that at the end when I talk about corporate markets. Payment for ecosystem services, again, should be thought about more seriously. Again, they're complex, but they can be done. The Nature Conservancy has done one in Nairobi with its Nairobi Water Bond or Water Fund. And other nature-based products as well. I think these fall into various categories. There are many that you simply shouldn't touch, particularly certain timber species. There are others that we should be exploiting better. I think of honey and aloes as industries which are very fragmented, very small, but could be taken to scale. And there are others that need to be managed much more tightly, but do create opportunities. I think in particular of sand, controversial, needs to be much better regulated. But certainly if it is going to be used, let's try to monetize it for conservation. And the key here is to build non-correlation. We all become too used to one revenue stream. And when one revenue stream falls down, you kind of need other revenue streams to be keeping going. So that's something that I think we need to think about more when we're designing revenue schemes in conservation. And we need more channels. I think a lot of these, I mean, I'm always amazed by how entrepreneurial this country is. I think there's probably a lot more actors that can play in these various spaces, and we need to give them the opportunities. More later on that when I come to the issue of partnering and contracting. Let me just try and work out how to, so just onto the next dynamic though. Generating revenue is one thing, how it's used is another. And this is increasingly important that we get this right, and it's not always done right enough. The issue of local economic impact is something that I think is very important. How much of the concession fees are vesting at a local level? How much of the employment chain is vesting at a local level, that value chain, the supply chain as well, even the tax chain? How much of the tax chain is vesting with local authorities versus centrally? And I think there's interesting opportunities, perhaps to use donor money to reorganize some of the ownership of these enterprises so that they can be aligned more closely or have more representation from local communities or even indeed local conservation organizations. That doesn't necessarily mean you need to increase footprint. There's an enormous number of proven de-risk businesses where some donor money could be used, and this would be in the benefit of the private sector partners as much as the beneficiaries, to think about diversifying the ownership of these businesses.
Charles, you have a minute.
Sure. We need to think outside conservation as well. There are sectors that are very relevant to conservation, but maybe far away from conservation areas. The whole issue of food production, energy production. Okavango Capital Partners is a private equity group looking to invest in these. It may do deals that are never anywhere near a conservation area. We need to manage costs down. It's not so much about cutting costs. I think we've all become experts at that recently. But the collaboration, sharing costs, allocating costs to people who are better organizations, better capable to manage it, building economies of scale which become more investable. And that brings to the fore the whole potential of public-private partnerships, which I think is a very interesting dynamic for KWS in particular to be thinking about. Boring but important, there are certain disciplines that need to be done better. If we are going to partner with more and varied actors in more and varied revenue streams, we need to get much better at partner selection. We need to get contracting much better. We need to manage the risk and reward and allocation of that better in contracts. The whole area of risk management needs to be much better done in conservation. And we need to stop just thinking about P&L accounts. We need to think about balance sheets. And we're seeing now the world being organized into institutions which have strong balance sheets and those with weaker ones. And if we get good at all of that, I think it does significantly increase the ability to access more capital. I think governments will be more willing to allocate public funding to conservation. Donor markets, who are never interested in black holes, will be more interested in supporting conservation. And I think the emerging interest, it'll be compromised right now, but it will come back from corporate and capital markets, could become a very, very important source of capital for conservation. Look at the bond that has just been given to Air France. It comes with all sorts of caveats. Air France, if it's going to get access to the bond, needs to be green. If you look at the BBC News this morning, look at the plans for rebuilding the UK economy. Again, caveats are being put around it in terms of greening. So if in the conservation sector, we get good at generating revenue, building incentives, managing costs properly, bringing some of these management, fiscal and legal disciplines into play, I think there's potentially a whole new world. And ironically, COVID may well have served to stimulate it. That's all, Helen. I'll stop there. I guess just to close, this presentation has 6 or so boxes on it. As Richard said, we need to break out of the box. Conventions are there, some of them are useful, but some of them need to be broken. And I can think of no better time to be doing this in this crisis. And frankly, I can think of no better country to be doing it. The examples I've given, they're mainly Kenyan and they're very real. So this is not just theory, these new opportunities. Thanks, Helen.
Thank you, Giles. I hope we will have time to come back. I think there's been a lot of, on the chat, people asking about the future of green, some of the kinds of things that Richard was talking about that are out of the box. So hopefully we have a few minutes to circle back and talk about those. So let me move right along and ask Simon Wardur to give your presentation from a development partner perspective.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. In the interest of time, I'm going to let Harry, who's helping with the presentations, run my presentation in the background, but I'm going to try and pick up on a couple of the points made by other participants, as well as some of the questions that we're getting from what I believe are the nearly 800 participants globally here. The first point I want to make is, I don't think we should be talking about building back to where we were post-COVID. It's actually about learning lessons and building back much better. So what are a couple of the lessons that I think we need to learn or to draw? First, I do think we need to have a science-based regulation of human interactions with nature. I think this is one of the key lessons to draw from this crisis, that there is a clear link between human well-being and planetary health, and ignoring that comes with a huge cost, as we're seeing today. Secondly, I think we need to think out of the box. We've got to think about innovative financing solutions and investments that can safeguard nature and everything that nature represents for us as humans and our economy. And last but not least, while we've got a number of our leaders who are perhaps at times uttering nationalistic statements, this is actually a moment for strengthening our multilateral systems and working better together. So I wanted to just then share with you a few thoughts on what the EU is doing to support Kenya generally, and also in this specific area of wildlife and conservation, and then turn perhaps to the last question, the million-dollar question, what are the lessons to draw, and what should we perhaps try and do differently together in the future? The first point I want to try and make in terms of what is the EU doing to try and support Kenya and developing partners is we've put an unprecedented package of nearly 15 billion euro on the table to help our development partners deal with the consequences of the COVID crisis. So if I take, for example, the area of wildlife, we're basically using every bit of flexibility we can in some of our ongoing programs. This means, for example, we're covering the salary costs of some of the rangers, we're providing rations to rangers, we're allowing funds to be diverted to help step up the anti-poaching strategies of both KWS and some of the conservancies. Since we've got participants from around the globe, let me just say one of the things we've done, and you can see a little reference to this on this slide, is we've launched a call for proposals which will provide grants of up to 150,000 euro to activists, to NGOs, to actors who are helping to protect wildlife and their associated livelihoods during this crisis. And that's all that's open now, and I would encourage everybody to benefit from this opportunity. Now, with the government of Kenya, we're providing a package of around 300 million euro. Some of this will be to support the government's own national development plan and response to COVID. So one of the challenges for the Cabinet Secretary, and he and I were discussing this earlier this week, is to make sure that protection of Kenya's wildlife and unique biodiversity features as a priority in the government's own response plan to COVID. Moving on to the future, what other opportunities there? The first thing I would just say is we shouldn't totally discard tourism. I agree with many who've spoken about the important role of tourism, but perhaps there is, the moment has come to look again at the tourist model. I mean, I think the days of putting people in a car for 4 to 6 hours a day to go and passively watch wildlife are over. That can be part of the offer, but that can't just be the sole offer. I think we need a bit more imagination, possibility for active holidays with engagement with wildlife, walking holidays, cycling holidays, holidays that encourage people to spend more time actually in and around nature. I think we need to try and increase the number of nights spent in conservancies, in hotels closely to the national park, not just the classical 2 or 3 nights. So this needs, I think, a bit of new thinking, so some new models. I think we also need to make a huge effort at increasing the numbers of people who are coming, both from a domestic market who are often outpriced, but also perhaps a model that can encourage middle-class families and not just multimillionaires to come to visit countries like Kenya. I heard the Brigadier on the revenue that the 10 biggest national parks bring to Kenya. Just one word of caution. I do think we shouldn't forget some of the other parks that perhaps don't have as much footprint, but play a hugely important role in securing the biodiversity and the nature. But I don't think tourism is enough alone. I think we've got to think very hard about how can we somehow give a monetary value to the preservation of nature and biodiversity. Now, 1 or 2 people in the discussion asked the question, what about children? What about the role for our young people? And I think one thing we need to try and do is capture the imagination of our young people for the need to protect nature and biodiversity in the same way that their imagination has been captured on the need to protect climate change and reduce our carbon footprint. We've seen the impact of Greta Thunberg and the similar movements elsewhere around the world. And I think if we could somehow mobilize that also to serve biodiversity, that would be a huge asset. On our side, we're at a key moment in deciding what our priorities should be for the next funding period. And I think one conclusion we have drawn for Kenya is that it will be hugely important to finance, if you like, a green transition flagship for Kenya as one of our top priorities for the next year, that can include as well looking at investment in nature, capital, climate smart agriculture, renewable energy, smart cities, and infrastructure. So it's not about returning to where we were before, it's returning to a much better form of growth that's sustainable in the long term. And that brings me just to the last point I want to make, which is that I think over the last few years, what we have seen in Kenya is that the model of wildlife protection, the model of the conservation model, has gradually been changing to move away from what I would perhaps describe previously as a command and control form of management to much more a community-based wildlife conservation model. We heard from Richard, for example, of some of the work that's been done in Old Pajeta. And I think this is a fantastic model that we need to see being replicated globally, where we're seeing community conservancies which are also looking at preserving the water towers, creating economic opportunities outside just the tourism model, and engaging much more with the local community. And I think this is the way forward. And this is something that, as we exit this crisis, we will be looking to support with the Cabinet Secretary, with some of the actors here in Kenya and elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. And let us go to our final panelist, and that is our Principal Secretary, Professor Fred Sigor. Professor, are you there?
Moderator, I think, all right, sorry. I thought the professor was not there because he sent a message.
Oh, welcome, Professor. We can't hear you, Professor. Check your mic whether it's on mute.
Madam. Hello, moderator.
Have we lost the professor?
Yes, we've lost professor.
Okay. Do you want to? His presentation is on the screen. Is there someone who can run us through it if we can't find him?
Can we get authority from Waziri?
I think because we are running out of time, we'll share the presentation of Professor Sigor. I cannot present it for him because I've not gone through the details about it. But okay. I think we can have the last point of wrapping up the discussion, because it's almost 7 minutes to the end of the discussion. So, moderator, maybe you can proceed.
Maybe I think in the interest of some of the questions that have coming through, and maybe Waziri, you can respond to this quite briefly, and I think Professor was going to cover it in his presentation, is we talked about some of the reforms that might be needed in the sector. Perhaps in just 2 minutes or 3 minutes, could you tell us what are your thoughts? Because as in a leadership role, I think you have reviewed some of the challenges and you have some thoughts about it.
Yes, thank you very much. It is important for us to know that there must be reforms. There must be reforms, and these reforms must start from the policy, and then the legal framework can change. I think post-COVID-19 is crucial. We must have a new policy. The policy that we are working on at the moment is 1975 policy. So we need to change it. And I can take you quickly, audience, that reforms must come in KWS. We have to reconfigure KWS. And I think Dixon has mentioned that it's overburdened to a responsibility. Then strengthening the regulatory aspect, the ministry itself, the State Department of Tourism to be strengthened. Strengthening the collaboration between county and county governments, because it's very important for us to make sure that we have collaboration, because the products and the parks and the animals are in counties. Enhance user rights. It's important for that people must own wildlife, not government. At the moment, everything is government. No, people must be proud of their wildlife. And I agree that people must feel part and parcel of this sector. It cannot be for the few, but it must be for everybody in this country. Then the other issue is strengthening the endangered species safeguard. I believe we should have a special bill to protect the endangered species. All of them, the endangered species must be protected. Marine protected areas must be also improved in its management. Enhance PPPs. I think Giles have mentioned, Simon has mentioned, and also Dixon has mentioned the issue of PPPs. How do we manage? I appreciate where Brigadier of KWS said, we have to shrink because of cost, but we cannot abscond our responsibility on parks even if they don't raise revenue. So we need to work and partner with others who will be able to address and safeguard the wildlife in those areas. So PPPs is very important. Issue of research and training, we need to enhance it. Issue of enforcing government, to make sure that government also focuses on funding wildlife as an important sector. This is very important. And also addressing the issue of human-wildlife conflict mitigation. I think we can't run away. There's a conflict between humans and animals, and we need to mitigate it. And finally, we need to establish a fund that will not be affected by the shocks, either of visitors or shocks of government budget cuts or shocks of environment. So we need a fund to be established. As I said earlier, there's almost $25 million being poured into the sector. $25 million is very small. Why don't we establish a $500 million endowment fund? And we take the proceeds of that endowment fund and use it and share it between government and also the conservancies, the community conservancies. This is very important for us to get the way forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Waziri. And a lot of the points you touched on are some of the ones that have been coming fast and furious, and that the others have been presented. There was a question of how we can actually put together a trust fund, and somebody in their questioning had actually named entities that could support us to get that trust fund so that we can reduce the dependency that we have on tourism. There have been questions about how government is supporting, how government is going to support KWS and other, especially the community institutions, through this crisis and moving forward into the future. There's been questions about the role of youth and what is the role of youth. We're talking about the future, and the future belongs to our youth, we always say. So what is their future and what is their role in creating resilient institutions? And what are out of the box? People are asking about in detail some of those out of the box strategies that you've talked about, but also a little bit of detail on some of the reforms that you've talked about that are really important. People are saying they like what you're saying about the reforms, they like what you're saying about the need for us to really review the whole sector and reorganize it so that it delivers for the future, and that we do not rely absolutely and completely on a narrow source of revenues for wildlife conservation. We are, of course, running out of time. We have only 2 minutes.
Maybe Helen, 1 minute. 1 minute I can come in. I want to take what Ambassador Simon Morde of European Union has said. We can't be thinking about, we want to rebound back to where we were. We must think, we must come back to a better wildlife sector. And we need to leap forward and say, whatever we used to do them right or wrong, we must be better this time. So we want 2021 to be a different wildlife sector, both in financing, in management, in technology, in investment as well. But more important, the people of Kenya must be in the center of the decision-making of the wildlife sector. We appreciate tourism has done very well for the sector. We appreciate the support by the development partners, excellent. We appreciate the participation of the NGOs, excellent. But we need to do better this time. Thank you very much.
And Waziri, you are spot on, because I'm looking at the charts that are flashing. and it is true, and I think there is a thread from those who are on the call saying there are lessons we've learned from the past. Let's take the strength, those lessons that have been strong, let us improve on them. But let us realize that business as usual, business as the past, is no longer going to work for conservation. We have lost wildlife. We have lost a lot of wildlife space with our old model, and it has not involved people sufficiently. I am told by somebody that we are avoiding the question of privatization and how we privatize some conservation areas. And so as we come to the end of this webinar, what I would say is that the interest from our participants is been overwhelming. The response is overwhelming. They have said they like what you're saying, Waziri, that you're being brave, that the presentations have been spot on, and that this dialogue really is just beginning, and that it is too short, and that I think we will need to come back with greater depth and greater thought and greater detail on what that future that we want, that new future we want for conservation and for wildlife is going to look like. And they are saying, excellent Waziri, excellent panelists. So I'm just giving you the view from the public that you have done well, that they have found this interesting and exciting. And we thank you for those of you who've participated and those of you who've been on the chat. We have great questions from you all, and we'll be trying to respond to them as much as possible. But I believe that we'll also use them to craft our next webinar, but also to craft and to utilize those ideas in driving change in this sector, because Kenya is important. Tourism and wildlife is important for Kenya. The role of people, the role of communities, the role of government are all really important in how this moves forward. So we thank you, and we look forward to hosting you again. And Waziri, please, would like you to host us again. So thank you very much.
We'll do that. We'll do that. Thank you very much. I want to thank Helen. I want to thank everybody here. I want to thank the audience and the Kenyan people for the support they've given to the government and to the wildlife sector. I see that we started with 830 people. Now we have gone down at 1.5 hours. We have lost only 60 people. So that is a good sign. So congratulations, all of us. I will want to commit here that every question that has been raised will be able to make us formulate the next agenda. Every question that we can be able to answer, we'll try to answer either directly or indirectly. So thank you very much, audience, and thank you very much, panelists, and the moderator, Helen Ishohi. Thank you very much.
Asante. Thank you and goodbye.